Welcome to the Sankofa Collaborative's workshop, Memorializing African American History, Cemeteries, Monuments, and Markers. We are thrilled that you've joined us today. This has been a pretty busy season for the Sankofa Collaborative. We have a couple of housekeeping notes. Just if you can, and I'm sure everyone's used to this, keep your microphones set on mute just to avoid background noise. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the program. You can post your questions in the chat space on Zoom. Know that the program is being recorded and that we will be circulating the recording via email, and we'll also post it on the Sankofa Collaborative website. Also, I'm glad Sam put this slide up because I know I would have forgotten. Mark your calendar for our June 1st program commemorating the Tulsa Massacre. For more details, you can visit our upcoming programs page, and we'll also be promoting it through our email blasts as well. Here's just a brief look at our agenda from 9 to 10:30. We'll be discussing Memorializing African American History, an introduction from 11 to 12:30. We'll be discussing cemeteries. We'll give you an hour to have lunch. I think that's very generous of us. And at 1:30, we'll resume with monuments and markers. And then at 3, there'll be a brief discussion of next. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Linda Epps. Dr. Linda Caldwell Epps, a longtime friend of mine, and actually the person who introduced me to the Sankofa Collaborative, which is among the many things I'm grateful to her for. She is president and CEO of 1804 Consultants and a founding member of the Sankofa Collaborative. She has more than 45 years of experience working with education and cultural institutions, including the New Jersey Historical Society and New Jersey Network Television and Radio. She was at Bloomfield College, where I met her, for 27 years, holding various leadership positions there as well. She founded 1804 Consultants in 2011 and works with history and cultural institutions within New Jersey and nationally. Some of these have included the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, the William Trent House, Newark Public Library, the Scotch Plains Public Library, Old First Church of Elizabeth, New Jersey, and the Timbuktu Historical Site. I am also pleased to introduce Garrido Schneider, who has spent his career cultivating human connections, community building, and lifelong learning within the arts. Mr. Schneider is executive director of Grounds for Sculpture since 2014, after spending 11 years in leadership roles at the Montclair Art Museum. Since coming to Grounds for Sculpture, he has implemented a new strategic vision to amplify the reach and impact of Grounds for Sculpture and has led the Sculpture Gardens transition from a founder-led model to one that is community-centric. He is committed to offering diverse audiences meaningful and vibrant encounters with art, nature, and one another. And he has reinforced Grounds for Sculpture's commitment to a democratizing approach to art and redoubled its efforts to deepen relationships with living artists. And if anyone on this call has not visited Grounds for Sculpture, it is a beautiful place and a great place to spend a day. And I understand the indoor exhibits will be opening soon. So I hope you'll take a beautiful day, take a ride, have lunch at that wonderful restaurant. And I think I'm going to put that on my to-do list as well.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I would just also like to mention that today's program is being sponsored by the New Jersey Historical Commission. We're very thankful for them for their ongoing support of our work. So good morning and welcome to the Sankofa Collaborative sponsored program on memorializing African American history, cemeteries, monuments, and markers. And as you saw, the day is divided into distinct sections, and it's our hope you'll be able to join us for all, but please understand that each section is designed as an entity of its own. And during this time, Gary and I hope to set the stage for the day, sharing some background on the why we think historic markers and cemeteries are critical to the overall field of the study of Black life and culture in the United States. And as the program states, again, we'll be setting the stage, and my remarks will fall under the category of history, memory, and acknowledgement. And I've divided my remarks into those three sections: history, memory, and acknowledgement. And the first is history. And can I have the first slide, please? Okay. Does history impact the way we see and think of ourselves and others? American author and civil rights activist James Baldwin often wrote about the way the past impacts the present. And according to him, history, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. So several years ago, I did a series of interviews with Newarkers who migrated to Newark during the Great Migration of the first half of the 20th century. And they just about all mentioned two things on their list that were a must to see when they arrived in the city. I think it's the next slide. Yes, okay. One was the seat at Lincoln that sat on a hill in downtown, the downtown district of Newark, in front of the Hall of Records. The migrants told me they would get dressed up, go down to the statue and take photos and send them back south. The photos were a symbol of one having arrived in the promised land of the North, ready to assume a new and a more successful life. I found working on another project that the Italians and the Portuguese had this same reverence for the seat at Lincoln, the symbol that Newarkers are proud of, a common memory of freedom and success. And the contentious history of African-American enslavement, despite 150 years of freedom and the election of an African-American to the presidency, still profoundly impacts our culture. The work of remembrance within the context of the present has a continuing significance for all as we navigate our way through this 21st century. We heard for 4 years it was time to take our country back. It was in the interest of taking our country back that we witnessed an insurrection on January 6th in our capital. And I'm not really sure what that meant, since we are all living on land that once belonged to Indigenous Americans. Were those in Washington attempting a coup to return the land to the Indigenous? I don't know. Next slide, please. Those of African descent have been present in New Jersey since its founding in 1664. With little acknowledgement for 3 centuries, those of African descent, both slave and free, have had an undeniable influence in shaping New Jersey's history and culture, as they have had in shaping the culture of the entire country. For a few minutes, I'm going to talk specifically about our state, as Sankofa began its journey concentrating on New Jersey. And I think I'm really using New Jersey as a microcosm for the country in general. These photos, by the way, are from Elizabeth, which was the first English speaking settlement in what became the colony of New Jersey. For those of you from Union County, that's Boxwood Hall on the upper right. And that is the Belcher Ogden mansion. And you see it with red coats, some skirmishes from the Revolutionary War actually took place there. There's actually a painting that they have of George Washington attending a wedding at the Belcher Ogden mansion, and just sort of fleeing. The British came across from Staten Island, and they heard that he was there, and he managed to escape. The historic diasporic experience of those African of descent until recently has largely been ignored. The Sankofa Collaborative for these nearly 5 years has intently tried to deepen that knowledge by relating how current events shape the lives of present-day members of the African diaspora and how their values and perceptions have historically had an impact on the greater social, political, civic, and cultural climate of New Jersey from the earliest settlements to the present. So how do we know what we know about the history of a city, a region, a state? So just reflect for a moment. Of course, you learned history in school. Perhaps through your parents, you learned about family history or the history of the area where you lived. But what particular history in school did you learn? Who were the original settlers? For New Jersey, we know of Berkeley and Carteret, but we rarely hear any mention of any women that were in that first band of English-speaking settlers who developed our first New Jersey city of Elizabethtown. In preparation for today, I did a cursory internet search to see what I could find out about that first lot of settlers. And this is from a document that I found. I think the next slide. Okay. The families that settled Elizabethtown needed to be self-sufficient, able to build their own homes, farm, hunt, spin thread, weave cloth, and in general provide for the needs of their family. Early houses were small and low ceilings and large fireplaces surrounded by fences in order to keep wild and roaming domestic animals out. While each family had to possess all the basic skills to build and sustain their lives in the wilderness, settlers also possessed specialized skills of value to the community as a whole. John Ogden and his sons were skilled brickmakers and stonemasons who built the sawmill and grist mill, set up a whaling company and a tannery. Peter Wolverson, a Dutchman with long experience as a brewer, set up a brewery and tavern. Francis Barber and William Kramer were carpenters. William Hill and the Whiteheads were cobblers. Matthias Hatfield and John Willents were weavers. Carteret and his commission, naming him governor of Nova Caesarea or New Jersey, and explained to those gathered that New Jersey had been granted to Berkeley and Carteret. He was also pleased to grant the inhabitants of New Jersey a liberal charter called the Concessions and Agreements, guaranteeing them, among other provisions, the rights of freemen of England. But not all of the signers were associates. Not all of the inhabitants were signers. A few may have been servants or day laborers who were not permitted to enjoy a town lot or were non-land owning families, members of associates. We do know that the Concessions and Agreement guaranteed that for every enslaved person brought to the new colony, landowners were allotted an additional 40 to 150 acres of land, depending upon the value of the enslaved person. Next slide. I don't know about you, but my schooling never mentioned the word slave when learning about New Jersey history. I do a good deal of lecturing around the state, and I have not yet spoken to an audience where someone in the crowd was unaware that the institution of slavery existed in the colony or the state of New Jersey. Many do not know that slavery existed north of the Mason-Dixon line. They learned, or at least perceived, that slavery was a Southern phenomenon. Once I mentioned the Concessions and Agreement and how free land was received for every slave, I asked them, when they find it incomprehensible that slavery could exist in New Jersey, who would give up the opportunity to receive free land, especially if your occupation is farming? They sort of think that I might know what I'm talking about after I answer that question. So later on today, you're going to hear from Dr. Wanda Lundy, who is the pastor of Siloam Hope First Presbyterian Church in Elizabeth. This is a photo of the church and of the graveyard that surrounds that church. And in the background on the right, you'll see the Union County Courthouse. Now, I grew up in Elizabeth as Presbyterian who had years of perfect attendance for attending church and Sunday school. I never heard of enslaved or African Americans living in the town prior to the 20th century. Yet, on the property of this church, there is a graveyard with around a few thousand graves. And we know of 400 people of African descent, most of them enslaved, who are buried in unmarked graves. They stopped burials in that cemetery, on that church property, in the latter to mid part of the 19th century. The graves date back to 1664. Some of the interred, we believe, are now buried underneath a tarred municipal parking lot that annexes the church property, which you can't see from this photo. But what you do see, the gravestones of the Anglo thousands who are interred there. There is one gravestone, one known gravestone of a person of African descent. The others are in a common mound. We know about many of them, and most of what we know about the interred of the Africans is through the records of the wills and the wills of the Anglos who are buried there. And along with this, many claim to not understand the Black Lives Matter movement. If those lives mattered, why aren't they recorded somewhere? Obviously they didn't. So I'm now going to memory, still using my hometown as a microcosm for perhaps all towns in our state, with the exception of the small Black towns that are here. Think of your town's annual parades. Think of monuments in your public square, the names on your buildings, the names of your streets and neighborhoods, and focal points on maps of your area. How many are African American related? I'll bet very few, if any. How is African American identity codified through family, space, and place? Or is it? It's a difficult question and a more even difficult answer. Now, we could say that is why the history and culture of African Americans is not in the public sphere. It's just too difficult, too complex, too painful to unearth and share. I'm thinking of all the presenters that we have with us today. And I do want to give you a glimpse into their, I don't want to give you a glimpse into their portion of the program, but you will see all the projects they represent, though some might be celebratory. They are about overcoming. Most have stories of overcoming in their cultures. There is, however, a major difference between ethnic history and culture and African American history and culture. The European immigrant came to these shores for the most part on a voluntary basis. They came in search of a better life. They came looking for opportunity. Not all of them, but most of them found a degree of better opportunity. Next slide, please. What binds their communities is celebration of overcoming and a shared history of the culture of their homeland, and how they managed to maintain parts of that culture in the United States. The Irish, the Italians, the German communities unite over their food, their shared customs, and the pride that they have in their homeland. Most African Americans, even with modern DNA kits, giving one a possible area of birth, do not have ties with their homeland unless they are very, very recent immigrants who came out of choice. African Americans who have been here for several generations came through capture and sale. They do not know what foods to recreate from home, what clothing indicates ethnic pride, the occupation of their forefathers. The celebration of feast days or local heroes are unknown to them. And their newly adopted home, the United States of America, did not offer any way to commemorate their experience or the life and death of their friends. Next slide, please. Creating opportunity for memorialization or acknowledgement did not come until the second half of the 20th century. I like to remind us almost each time we meet that freedom did not materialize during the mid-19th century at the conclusion of the Civil War. It came, although still limited, in the third decade of the 20th century, at the conclusion of legal Jim Crow. If you look at the scale here, you'll see 1619, which is the date that we start counting the importation of African slaves, although we know that it really happened before that, to 1865. Without a doubt, people were held, most Africans were held in bondage. 1865, the end of the Civil War, people were thought to be free, but in truth, they were not because of Jim Crow and segregation laws, Black codes and segregation laws, which did not come to an end until the 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education. From that point on, we went into the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And it was not until then that legislated freedom really began to take hold. Remember the days when we heard James Brown roaring from jukeboxes saying, "Say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud," and how unique and controversial that was? Swiss, Germans, Swedes were always allowed to be proud of their skin color and their heritage. I'll admit it was a little murkier for Italians and Eastern Europeans, but most Europeans had a degree of pride in their homeland. Once freedom came for African America, the former enslaved built their institutions based upon European models, with bits of African culture they could manage to remember and pass on through oral history. Remember, families were often sold and separated. The rules constructed for the enslaved prohibited reading and writing and gathering pre and post emancipation. The formerly enslaved formed their communities, built their churches, organized fraternal organizations, educated their children as best they could, considering that their color placed them in a caste whose definition was unworthy of full citizenship. Punishment was constructed to be as brutal as possible, so the memory of infraction of the rules would be always in mind. Next slide. Let me offer an example or two or three. There's a long history of demonstrative displays against Black people in America. The enslavers performed barbaric acts on the bodies of so-called disobedient enslaved Africans as a punishment to the person deemed guilty, but also as a deterrent to the fellow enslaved people who saw or heard of it. It was the flaying of flesh, the human beings being torn apart by hounds, the stiff bodies dangling from the stiff. That was their memory. The display was the thing. The theatrical production of pain to the point of mutilation was the thing. The transmission of trauma, which was almost more important than the act itself. Next slide. When the enslaved rebelled, this theater was taken to even higher levels. The German Coast Uprising of 1811 in Louisiana, one of the largest slave revolts in United States history, ultimately failed. But so intent were the white enslavers to terrorize the remaining enslaved, never to repeat an attempted coup again. Some of the leaders were captured, placed on trial, and later executed. Their heads were cut off and placed on poles along the river in order to frighten and intimidate other slaves. This display of heads was placed on spikes stretched over 60 miles of the riverfront. This is a memorial this image is a memorial dedicated to honor those who were beheaded and put on display. Another example, when Nat Turner staged his revolt some 20 years later, the response took on a similar expression. As Dana Ramey Berry, a professor of history and African diaspora studies and the chair of the history department at the University of Texas at Austin, wrote for the New York Times in 2016 about Turner's 1831 hanging. I'm using her words. Those who came to witness his death then decapitated and skinned him. They bragged about it for decades. One participant, William Mallory, also known as Buck, gloated so much about having skinned Turner that it was listed in his obituary. She wrote that one of her students even claimed that his family was in possession of a purse made from Nat Turner's skin. So those institutions, for those of the European caste, were largely closed to them, which kept them, African Americans, and any kind of commemorative structures excluded from the children of Africa. Their cliques were not bound by ethnic pride, but by their common history of forced servitude and all the obstacles that choked their progress during and after the physical shackles were removed. Their underclass status kept them out of restaurants, movies, positions of authority and power. It also kept them out of municipal government and the decision-making powers that went with it. It kept them out of most cemeteries. They were relegated to potter's fields or mass unmarked graves. Just a personal story, I have a friend who had a death in her family and wanted to bury that person in a cemetery closest to her home. I'm talking about the 1980s. And she was told, well, that cemetery, we've never known, by the undertaker, we've never known them to accept bodies of colored people in that particular cemetery. So it goes on until today. Next slide. Okay. Their togetherness, African Americans that is based on their history of enslavement, their history of oppression, a calculated and deliberate history of horrible violence, and more recently, their history of overcoming. In 1884, Frederick Douglass acknowledged the importance of memory in charting the course for the future. According to him, memory was given to man for some wise purpose. The past is the mirror in which we may discern the dim outlines of the future, and by which we may make them more symmetrical. Memory is now considered an important feature in the discipline of public history. To these individuals, memory and history are intertwined. So I'm now moving to acknowledgement. How do we provide living and learning and recreational spaces dedicated to working with memory and creating stories of our shared past by providing the opportunity to contribute narrative and material objects that represent family history, recognizing that this history has contributed to the culture that is New Jersey or New York or Pennsylvania or Hawaii or the United States as a whole. We firmly believe in the need to draw inspiration and guidance from the past, and through that inspiration, people may find the tools and paths that may help live their lives without the misinformation and myth provided by those that would have had and still would have us live as a nation divided by race, class, and ethnicity. Next slide. First, we must develop opportunities to voice the stories of the oppressed, not only those stories of the oppression, but those of the coping abilities learned and the devices used to survive, and the success of the children and the sacrifice of the ancestors. We must, through our institutions, expand the opportunity for narration and documentation and make our places of education and culture synonymous with providing programs and materials for research concerning our rich diversity. We should also aim to provide opportunity to tell the story of our stories, using diverse voices and encouraging possibilities for cross-cultural communication and appreciation. We understand and wish to communicate the understanding that New Jersey's history is a history of racial and ethnic groups. These groups do not exist in isolation. Their histories are interwoven into our nature. And although Anglo culture may be considered the dominant culture, our racial and ethnic groups have been an important and undeniable ingredient in the culture that is New Jersey, that is the United States. Next slide. It was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., well over half a century ago, who wrote in his letter from a Birmingham jail, "I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. We are caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, when whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Our learning is impoverished when we are in a homogeneous group of like-minded individuals who share the same kinds of experiences, beliefs, and aspirations. It is our diversity that has shaped the culture that is the United States. And our job as educators, culturalists, artists, and citizens is to provide a stereoscopic view of history that will lead to a more detailed and thought-provoking way of analyzing the past. We hope that this will lead to the willingness, and I'm talking about Sankofa when I say rate, a willingness to listen and to understand history from multiple perspectives that informs our present and future and leads to a more collegial society. We will not reach our full potential as a nation until we understand the reality and the beauty of our diversity and willingly put into practice those humanist skills that will result in a nation whose culture embraces total inclusivity. Not until we have achieved inclusive excellence can we make a claim as living up to the ideals as a nation that still purports to be the land of the free and the home of the brave. Next slide. Our institutions, our projects, our memorials, our public spaces must attempt to provide a social framework for historical memory and interpretation for the active engagement of visitors and their descendants by providing opportunity to record one story and to contribute materials that are relevant to family, space, and place. We should be exploring the narrative of movement and development of work and play, of family and of faith. Our intent should be to provide living spaces dedicated to working with memory and creating stories of our shared past by providing the opportunity to contribute narrative and material objects that represent family history, recognizing that this history has contributed to the greater culture that is New Jersey and the country. We firmly believe in the need to draw inspiration and guidance from the past, and through that inspiration, people may find the tools and paths that may help them live their lives. The word disfranchise must be removed from our vocabulary. We aim to expand the user base of our institutions and make it synonymous with providing programs and materials for research concerning our rich diversity. Oops, I just mistakenly closed down my notes. Okay, got them back. We also aim to provide opportunity to tell the story of our state using diverse voices and encouraging possibilities for cross-cultural communication and appreciation. And we understand and wish to communicate that understanding that New Jersey's history is a history of racial and ethnic groups. These groups do not exist in isolation. Their histories are interwoven in nature. And although Anglo culture may be considered the dominant culture, our racial and ethnic groups have been important and undeniable ingredient in the culture that is New Jersey. Another slide, please. Okay. I may sound a little like gloom and doom, but actually I think we are in a new era. I know we are in a new era. Why else would so many have descended upon the Capitol on January 6th to try to take over the government? Fear, because they also understand that we are in a new era. I think it's a combination of desegregation, a better educational access to higher learning, the Obama family in the White House, and unfortunately the murder of George Floyd on national television that have allowed us to reach a new level. Next slide. There really is good news for those who labor in the vineyards of American history. Never before have Americans been as receptive as we are now to historical narratives that challenge long, steady, mostly unfortunate assumptions about our past. Over the past generation, scholarship on every major chapter of American history has changed in revolutionary ways, which is having a substantial influence on the national psyche, on public history, on preservation, on Hollywood movies, on history teaching in public schools, on historic sites, museums, exhibitions, public art, the internet, and in conversations in barbershops, beauty parlors, bars, and at the dinner table. What used to be called the New American history, a history that placed a cross-section of Americans on the stages of the past, is now middle-aged, largely accepted as conventional and at the center of the history of America. Next slide. Think of the movement to replace revisionist statutes. Why so? Why has a more liberal, progressive, and controversial history prevailed over the old, largely mythological narrative of the making of American democratic life? It may have something to do with the maturity of the American Republic. Consider that we have a woman of African and Asian descent as vice president. Who would have ever thought? Consider the dismantling of Confederate statues in a plethora of municipalities all over the country. Consider the work of the panelists that will join us today and the work they are doing to bring the voices and life experiences of so many to the surface. Consider the Academy Awards ceremony this past Sunday night with an Asian woman, Chloe Zhao, winning for Best Director, and an African-American woman, Regina King, opening the program. Consider colleges and universities unearthing their history with slavery, and even more, their attempts to reconcile to their wrongdoing. Consider the richly commemorative season we are living through. We are in the midst of planning for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and we know so much more about this event. It is now conventional knowledge that the war marked the beginning of the end of the old racist society to enslave Black people. And we know it marked the beginning of a new kind of nation that began to recognize that slavery might not be a good thing as Americans agonizingly sought to create a more perfect union. Next slide. Consider that major streets in cities throughout the country have Black Lives Matter painted in neon yellow on their major streets. And once more, with many of those painted streets a year old, cities are having many of them refreshed as the paint is beginning to fade. It's not just a fad. We now have a coterie of new heroes and heroines. We have known about Harriet Tubman, but she has become a heroine to men, women, and children of every hue. Her movie is on HBO daily. We might even have a $20 bill with her image replacing that of Thomas Jefferson. Chadwick Boseman, with his portrayal of Black Panther, had young and old, Black and white, crossing their arms and saying, "Wakanda forever." George Floyd's murderers have been brought to trial, and thus far, a just verdict has been issued. Yes, we still have a way to go, but let's put things in perspective. Just last week, while preparing for a talk for a local college university, I told the story of the murder of Emmett Till. Next slide. In 1956, just months after being acquitted in the lynching of a 14-year-old Emmett Till, his killers gave an interview to Look magazine, right? Months after being found not guilty, they gave an interview to Look magazine in which they confessed to the murder. As one of Till's killers, J.W. Millam, said of the killing, "I just decided it was time a few people got put on notice that as long as he lived, Black people," and he really used a slur, racial slur, "are gonna stay in their place. As long as I'm living, I'm gonna make sure that they do." He said, he goes on to say, "I just made up my mind. Chicago boy," I said, "I'm tired of him sending your kind down here to stir up trouble. God damn you, I'm gonna make an example of you, just so everybody can know how me and my folks stand." They pistol whipped Till, made him strip naked on the banks of the Tallahatchie River that Sunday morning, shot him through the face, then tied a fan from a cotton gin to his neck with barbed wire and pushed him in. Till's face would emerge nearly unrecognizable, as you see here. Next slide. There's no way for me to know if Chauvin intended to kill Floyd, but there is an abundance of evidence of a depraved indifference about Floyd's life. His murderer was found guilty. My point here is that there are echoes in Floyd's killing in public, in front of his community, in broad daylight, that reverberate from centuries of killings of men and women who look like Floyd, whose killings the system of the time validated or even shielded. And I just read you the Till example. It is hard not to draw the line from a noose on the neck to a knee on the neck. And it's also hard not to recall that few people were ever punished for lynchings. Motionless Black bodies have been the taboo upon which the American story has unfolded. And Floyd's body is sadly but one of the latest examples. Forgive me, this acknowledgement section, again, is supposed to be positive, so let me get back on track. But I was trying to show you how progress really has been made. Next slide. With new scholars specifically trained for work in African American studies, texts long obscured by shallow research and an indifference to what African Americans had written and spoken, sung and shouted, increasingly came into play. There are emerging relatively new heroes and heroines whose lives as slaves and freedmen and freed women significantly redefined or expanded the nation's sense of the making of heroes. Indeed, over the past century, the narrative of African American trials, tribulations, triumphs, persistence, and of course corrections has moved from the margins of American historical scholarship to the near center of a much larger story at the intersection of democracy and race. But his murderer, again, was found not guilty. The ascent of African Americans and other Americans long on the margins of society has enlivened interest in the acknowledgement and preservation of places where all sorts of experiences were hammered out in modest dwellings, churches, school buildings, businesses, Indian communities, places that were safe havens, places that were battlegrounds during the modern civil rights movement, and places nearly lost forever. The future of our past has been long contested. However, it would seem that we have broken free of the old fear that our history is incoherent, without unity, without a credible narrative. I believe we are experiencing an acknowledgement of a complicated, diverse, evolving, rigorous revamping of American history and American memory. Next slide. For example, when the African American burial ground in Lower Manhattan was discovered in 1991 during the excavation for a new federal office building, elected officials, historic preservationists, and civic activists knew that the anonymity that colonial slavery had imposed had to be at once acknowledged and ended through what has become an important historic site managed by the National Park Service. I have to believe it also led to the blockbuster Slavery in New York exhibit at the New York Historical Society and the continued interest in maintaining Brooklyn's Weeksville. Next slide. The civil rights movement's most iconic battleground, the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, is now a historic site and a tourist attraction. Its monumentalized presence enables a cross-section of Americans to acknowledge conflict, defiance, and an expansive heroism in our nation's recent and distant past, which is arguably the synthesis of contemporary scholarship on the civil rights movement. Next slide. In Newark, New Jersey, a commemorative ethos has, and you'll hear more about that this afternoon from Fahimi Shakur, has helped the city remember the civil rights unrest that occurred in July of 1967. The infamous riots of that year were tragic and accelerated a decline that was sweeping much of the city for many years following World War II. And yet Newark, now a recovering city with a still small but growing number of urban assets, may just become the first American city to preserve a site that once symbolized the beginning of a riot. The old 4th Precinct now symbolizes the tenacity of Newark to survive as a post-industrial city with a complicated memory of itself and a dedication to justice. Hopefully one day in the near future, efforts will be underway to preserve the 4th Precinct as a historic site. I quote the well-known late New Jersey historian, Dr. Clement Alexander Price, who said that there are two kinds of pressures or challenges facing commemorization: to freeze frame the past so that people in the present have some notion of what the past was composed of, and two, to respond to what the present does to the past. More than any generation of history and cultural stewards, we are now equipped to serve both objectives very well indeed. So I will end my remarks with two quotes from Toni Morrison, one of realism and one of hope. The first, realism. Toni says, "I'm interested in the way in which the past affects the present. And I think that if we understand a good deal more about history, we automatically understand a great deal more about contemporary life." And the second quote, next slide, please. "For lo, the winter is past. The rain is over and gone. The flowers appear on the earth. The time of the singing of birds is come, and the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land." And next slide, please. To me, our mixed heritage, our mixed racial identity, can symbolize the voice of the turtle dove being heard throughout our land. So I'm done, and I'm going to turn it over to Gary. And I hope I left you some time, Gary. I'm so sorry. I read slower than I thought I would. It went much faster before.
I know, I'm good. Let's see if I can get my screen shared here.
And I wasn't looking. I see so many of you have joined us while I was delivering my remarks. I was concentrated on my script. Welcome.
All right, I'm hoping everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
Great. So thank you, Linda, for those opening remarks. And I think there's some segue and overlap here into where I'd like to take the last remaining time for this morning. So my name is Garrido Schneider. I'm the executive director of Grounds for Sculpture. It's a sculpture park focused on large-scale sculpture set in beautiful landscape grounds. But we've been thinking a lot over the last couple of years about ways in which the work that we're doing could be more reflective, responsive, and relevant to the times in which we live in, engage more directly with community, be more inclusive in our approaches. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking this past year about the incredible shifts within the public sphere around monuments. And this particular image is one of the ones that is, for me, one of the most iconic ones from the 2020 that I think sums up so much of, Linda, what you were speaking about, and also points us towards the future. So public memory, historic reckoning, and redress. I'm going to talk about some contemporary interventions, contemporary artists, as well as activists that are rethinking, removing, replacing, and reimagining monuments in the public sphere. Before I begin, though, some stats to kind of ground the work here. So, 2020 was a transformative year. I, like Linda, have a sense of optimism that this is a sign of progress moving forward, and that incredible movement has been made this year. 168 Confederate symbols were renamed or removed from the public spaces in 2020. The Southern Poverty Law Center began tracking Confederate monuments in 2015 when they recognized that the still pervasive presence of these symbols of hate and the lies about our American history were again being leveraged and used to incite violence and as focal points for violence. And so they began to track where all these symbols were. These include monuments, statues, plaques, and markers, schools, parks, names of cities, military bases, streets, highways, schools, etc. In 2020, 94 monuments were removed. But I think it's sobering to recognize that there are still over 2,000 Confederate symbols that are still presented out in the public, 704 of those that are symbols of, that are monuments. One note that the Southern Poverty Law Center doesn't track, but that I also have been watching this past year, are removals of other monuments, most notably monuments of Christopher Columbus, that particularly indigenous communities have been calling for removal for many years. To put this in some perspective, and for those of you that might want to do a little bit more research of where these monuments are, there is an interactive map that the SPLC does keep track of. And you can go in and this on my screen is not interactive right now, but you can look at both currently active ones, and there's also a filter to look at the ones that have been removed. There's also a Wikipedia page of the list of monuments and memorials removed during and after and following the global protests following George Floyd's murder. I bring these up, I know where the focus today is to talk about memorializing African-American history, and these clearly memorialize other histories. And I think it's really critical that there's space that is made. And I think as we think about addressing the stories and narratives and histories that are in the public sector, we do have to address the sort of overbearing presence of other histories that are in the space and make space. So the intro image I had was of the sculpture of Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia, which became an epicenter of protests this summer. Became a focal point for protesters against police brutality and racism. This iconic and controversial sculpture is on a monument boulevard in Richmond, a series of Confederate monuments throughout this entire boulevard. It is now covered in a colorful blanket of graffiti, much of it denouncing police brutality and demanding for the end of systemic racism and inequality. Clashes between police and protesters gathering near the sculpture became a regular occurrence in the summer, but it also became a place where people of all ages and races gathered to peacefully witness a piece of history and become a part of the voice of change. I think there's an incredible way in which this sculpture, and we think about reckoning and contextualizing history. And in some ways that could be done with placards and markers, but it was done so powerfully this summer with people in protest and gathering and reclaiming this space. It became part vigil, part focal point for protest. As we saw with the ballerinas on the page before, a celebration of culture and pride. The artist Derek Klein added an incredible layer to this, and I think this is a way like the graffiti that covered this, but these are projected onto this, creating a living monument that addressed the urgency of our time. And I think the Frederick Douglass quote here, "Power concedes nothing without a demand, never did and it never will," I think speaks to the kind of forceful nature in which the protests and the push against the Confederate monuments has been made. It should be noted that Virginia had restrictive laws that precluded the removal of these monuments. That law has been changed, and this particular monument to Robert E. Lee is set to be taken down, although it's being challenged, continued in court. So we will see what the future holds for this monument, but it had been a critical part of the conversations around the future of monuments in the United States this past year. 10 blocks away from that Robert E. Lee sculpture, an incredible new sculpture was installed at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. This is a sculpture by the artist Kende Wiley. Many will know Kende Wiley probably for his most famous portrait of President Obama. But Kende Wiley made his start of his career in the early 2000s by co-opting and subverting historic European paintings, equestrian paintings of military leaders on, on horseback, and repositioning the character in those to feature everyday Black and brown male figures, many from that he would find in Harlem, where his studio was, as models. This is his first large-scale public sculpture. It was unveiled in Times Square and then moved down into Virginia. And I see this as an incredibly powerful, both symbol of representation and again, an inclusive, making that more inclusive, but also an incredibly powerful retort to the monuments of Confederacy that are a mere 10 blocks away. It's also important to note that directly across the street from the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts is the memorial to the Daughters of the Confederacy. And so in many ways, this young, strident Black male is staring down and directly facing down the memorials to the Confederacy in Virginia. Work here was installed in 2017 or 2018 in the city of Philadelphia. It's by the artist Hank Willis Thomas. It's incredibly powerful, enlarged Afro pic with a Black power fist raised to the sky. Stands in front of the city hall, and so a direct assertion of identity, of pride, in the center of the city, facing off here against again, this very symbolic symbol of the United States government, became a focal point of both pride and engagement for the city. But it also was directly situated not just against City Hall, but next to a much reviled sculpture of the former mayor and former police commissioner in Philadelphia, Frank Rizzo. Some of you will remember the kind of brutality and violence that occurred against communities of color in Philadelphia under his leadership, and his sculpture at the steps of City Hall has been a focal point for protest since it was installed in the early 1990s. And Hank Willis Thomas sculpture is again in direct vicinity, direct conversation, and again, in direct protest to the presence of this sculpture by Frank Rizzo. Again, this sculpture has since been acquired by the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts. It is, so it will remain in the Philadelphia community. This is from 2018, but over the course of this last year, I'm going to shift the focus to the continued protests around the Frank Rizzo sculpture. Again, much like the Robert E. Lee sculpture, it became a focal point for protests within the city of Philadelphia, invariably with police trying to protect it and protesters using it as a rallying cry and point of protests. And again, some of my staff may be on the call, and so this is a little irreverent of me as the director of a museum focused on sculpture to be focused on what might be conceived as vandalism. But I am really thinking of these as sites of protest, and that our monuments in our public sector are artifacts of our history, and that for many years, aspects of that history have been left out of the story. And that these actions, these interventions that have occurred by the people have been adding a layer. It is a little more, I think, a visceral layer than a plaque that recontextualizes. But I think some of the figures and some of the violence that is inherent in these figures, histories, I think requires something of this demand, particularly when it's so persistently resistant to being removed. Or making space for other stories to be told. I'm happy to say that in the cover of Night, the Frank Rizzo sculpture was deinstalled this summer, again, culminating close to 3 decades of protest driving for that change. And there's something, a slide that I did remove were some of the slides of some of, you will know that part of the violence that occurred in Philadelphia included, raids against the Black Panther headquarters and the home of move, another sort of Black Pride and Power movement in the city of Philadelphia that resulted in a bombing of by the city police of a complete square block in Philadelphia. And so again, the violence is quite extreme that's associated with this figure. And there's something quite poignant about the image on the right, where there's this sort of quiet emptiness and maybe a moment for breath. And I think this is, again, when I say that there needs to be some space that's cleared to make space for news stories. An equally divisive figure in history. I'm now shifting over to England here with a statue of Edward Colston, a notorious slave trader. I'm sure that the plaque here speaks to him as a sort of a philanthropist and a businessman, but one that made his fortune through the transatlantic slave trade. This is an image from about 2 years ago, and this has become, again, this sculpture had become a site of protest and contention, but also for intervention. And so this particular artistic intervention placed 100 sculptures of bodies at the foot of the sculpture, placing the Colston sculpture almost as if he is the captain of the ship looking over the deck. Here, the layout of the figures is following and reminiscent of the horrific and haunting diagrams of the transatlantic slave ships that this particular individual owned. The contextualization of this is both looking back at the history of Colston, but also thinking about the continuation of slavery in our current world. There are some stats that say there are more people in indentured servitude and slavery today. And this particular artwork is calling out some of the kinds of labor and workforces that are most vulnerable to that exploitation. Again, that was about 2 years ago, and fast forward to this summer, this sculpture, and as the Black Lives Matter movement spread globally, began to again be a focal point. The sculpture was forcibly removed, and there's something quite, I think, poignant and fitting that it ended up at the bottom of the river. It has been fished out, but it has not been reinstalled. And like many of the monuments that have been removed, they leave these empty plinths or platforms for new sculptures to be to take their place. In this case, it's more of a memorial with the placards from Black Lives Matter. But the day after the sculpture was removed, a sculpture of a Black Lives Matter protester was installed for a number of days before the city of Bristol removed it. As I mentioned, in addition to the contention around Confederate monuments, there's been an increased scrutiny and focus of a variety of monuments. And I think as we think about New Jersey, I think the prevalence of monuments to George Washington and to others involved in the American Revolution call for some recontextualization. In the city of Trenton, the statue of Columbus has been removed, and they're boarded up a sculpture in the Mill Hill neighborhood of George Washington and have added some contextual placards to give a little more context to George Washington's role in the institution of slavery. I think this is, again, this adding this layer of the sort of power of the public mark and graffiti. There's something quite iconic about this image. There's a unusually dark patina. Just as a sculpture person, this particular sculpture is quite unique, but there's something quite religious, almost Christ-like, but also this very haunting blood on the hands of Christopher Columbus. This same sculpture was also recontextualized and intervened by the artist Yori Minanya, as an Afro-Dominican artist, who sheathed the sculpture in fabric that is, it's hard to see in these images here, but they are sort of like hyper stereotypical tropical patterns. And so she's uses these sort of patterns to comment on the tourism of and sort of the romanticized stereotypical visions of the tropics. And so I'm bringing this to say that not all interventions with the public sculptures require them being, as some might refer to as vandalized or displaced, but that there can be these other kinds of contemporary interventions that recontextualize and bring a greater narrative to the history of these sculptures. This is Christopher Columbus sculpture in Minnesota. Christopher Columbus in Boston. And again, I think there's an inherent violence in all of these. And I think there's, in many ways, it is forcing us to contend with the inherent violence that occurred with the so-called discovery of the New World and the genocide that occurred here in the United States to the indigenous populations, and the inherent violence that occurred through the institution of slavery being brought to the United States and to the New World. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that these are, it's very dangerous to take down these very large sculptures. And so I purposely didn't show some of the videos or photos of people pulling them down by ropes, because it is quite dangerous. I would put out that Grounds for Sculpture is quite skilled at both commissioning and working with artists to create new works of art. And I imagine as we move forward and we begin as an institution to recover from COVID and begin to regain a little bit more of our footing, we'll be looking to expand on the 50 or so sculptures that we have out in the public and begin to partner more thoroughly with and more in different ways with the public to create new public sculpture out in our region and our communities. But we also have the skill and the network of skilled labor, including crane operators and folks that can rig and remove sculptures. So we could be a partner for those of you that are on the call that are looking for ways of initiating new works in your communities. And we're happy to have conversations and perhaps find synergy, but we can also be a good network for the safe removal of contentious monuments. To share just a few other monuments that I think begin to point towards a more inclusive approach to monuments. In New York City this past year, there was an exhibition called Monument Now, which invited artists to imagine monuments for the 21st century. This is a pyramid-like sculpture inspired by the pyramids in Mesoamerica, but also in the Mississippi Delta area by a Choctaw indigenous artist, Jeffrey Gibson. This sculpture became a platform. So it is both an iconic symbol here in the city skyline of New York City, but it also became a physical stage and platform. And as I think about the contemporary ways in which monuments can be rethought, there's something about permanence, and there's something about the static nature of the kind of historic figure on the horse. And the Kende Wiley sculpture is taking that language and subverting it and owning it, and placing a young Black man in contemporary clothing with sneakers and a hoodie, and he has ripped jeans in that image, and taking that historic language and subverting it. But I think there's a place also for monuments that are more transient. And I think the notion of permanence and static nature of monuments, I think, is part of the problem when we think about the multiplicity of stories that have not been told and that need to be told. And so in this case, the artist created the artwork, but then over the entire course of the year, partnered with other indigenous BIPOC artists to create performances, poetry readings, and other kinds of interventions that used his sculpture essentially as a stage. Nicholas Galinin is another artist who I've been looking very closely at over the past year. This is a work that actually was installed in Sydney. But it's, again, when we think about the ways in which we can recontextualize monuments, this is a monument. It was based on a monument to Captain Cook. But I think this idea of digging a grave for a monument is very generative for me of ideas of various ways in which we might respond to the monument and create new stories. And again, co-opt that language of the monument to make space for a more inclusive narrative. This is a beautiful and transfixing work that was installed in Philadelphia as part of a series of investigations into what monuments could be by the artist Catherine Oliver. Catherine Olivier, who took a sculpture of the Georgetown Monument, which commemorated a revolutionary battle in the city of Philadelphia. But in the same park, there was a historic monument to the Pistorius Monument, which was a memorial to an attempted liberation of slaves led by the Germantown founder, Francis Daniel Pistorius. Over the course of that of the time, the Pistorius Monument has been inadvertently covered and boxed in by the city of Philadelphia, feeling that the story of these sort of abolition and liberation movement was not a story that they wanted to be told. It was not, as they quoted, an American story. Yet the monument here on the left has always remained out and in view. And so the artist wanted to kind of play with these ideas of covering and revealing and concealing, and created this incredibly beautiful mirrored surface that both concealed the history of that monument, but then reflected the community around it. This is another, I think, way of thinking about inclusion. This particular work is by the artist Mel Chin. It is a completely ADA accessible ramp that allows individuals to get up onto the podium and become the monument themselves. And as we begin to think about who and what stories get monumentalized in the public sector here, again, the monument becomes the stage. This is another work by the artist Hank Willis Thomas, who I showed earlier, the image of the Afro pick with the Black Power fist raised in the city of Philadelphia. This is another work that is installed in Brooklyn. It's called Unity. And as we think about moving from removal and contending with and challenging the history of monuments in the public sector, and we make space for other stories, Hank Willis Thomas is entering into that space and creating stories and works like this that I think have a decidedly hopeful quality. Titled Unity, points upward to the sky. It has a somewhat aspirational, hopeful, connecting, almost spiritual component for me, pointing up, but it is also incredibly powerful. Again, this kind of very striking entrance into the public sector. Hank Willis Thomas has also been selected out of a number of artists to create a memorial to Martin Luther King that will be installed in the city of Boston. This work, entitled Embrace, this is the rendering. I believe the work is still in production. It's been slightly delayed by COVID. And as Hank Willis Thomas says, I think public art is propaganda, frankly. Most of the public art we grew up around was white men on horses looking down on us. The question of the day is, how do we imagine new public art? A new way of championing the spirit of people who we find inspiration from, athletes, activists, and yes, perhaps sometimes maybe soldiers. But we have so many memorials for war and so few for peace. That can't be by accident, and it's not sustainable for our psyche. And so he's proposed this sculpture inspired by, in his words, by the images of protesters walking arm in arm during the civil rights era marches, and is calling for a sculpture and a landscape that calls people towards empathy and action. And so as we move forward, like Linda, I'm moving more towards the hopeful here as we move forward and imagine what are the possibilities for new monuments and sculptures as we move forward into the future. And with a little bit of time that I have left, I want to go over just a couple of resources, knowing that we've got a wide range of attendees here, some of you who are working in education, some in history settings, others in museums. So a couple of resources I just point out that I think can help as we begin to think about designing the monuments of the future. That can happen both at the civic level and in the cities, and it can happen within our own institutions, but it can happen very much also at in schools and at the personal level. Monument Lab is a Philadelphia-based organization that curated a number of the projects that I saw. So it's definitely an organization that I think is leading the conversation around both recontextualizing and challenging the monuments in our world, but then also providing tools and platforms for artists to rethink and imagine and propose new monuments. So this is an incredible field trip or field guide curriculum that I think, in the way it's designed, it looks like it's quite friendly for, for children and youth, but actually any of the activities and questions here, I think could be even used if we as institutions were looking to challenge works in our communities or to propose and create new monuments. Monument Lab also just recently received a $4 million grant from the Mellon Foundation. They're going to be conducting a national audit of monuments throughout the United States, similar to the one that I showed from the of the Confederate monuments, but this will be inclusive of all monuments and thinking about a wide intersectional kind of lens of gender, race, stories, geography, history, as they create this national audit, which should be completed within the next year. And one of the most exciting things for me is to see, this history of monuments, this kind of reckoning really coming to a point in terms of the public, but also institutions and funders and governments and cities are also reckoning in really unimaginable ways a few years ago. The same way in which schools are renaming buildings that for decades they resisted renaming. There are new resources that are being made. And so the Mellon Foundation has set aside $250 million to be dispensed over the next 5 years to fund new monuments, memorials, and historic telling spaces, to contextualize existing monuments, and to relocate existing monuments and more memorials. I would note, and disappointment to probably many on the call, that the foundation does not accept uninvited proposals. But just to give you a sense of some of the ways in which these funds are working, it's the audit of the monuments through Monument Lab. But the first projects they've included funding for also include the Emmett Till Interpretive Center, the funding for the Los Angeles County Museum of Art to develop augmented reality tools and apps that allow the public to create new monuments into the public sphere. A design company in Massachusetts that's actually working with Hank Willis Thomas on the Martin Luther King Memorial, funding to increase their ability to work with other organizations and individuals around the country to build new monuments. And then a major art installation in New Orleans called Prospect New Orleans. The focus this coming year in 2021 will be monuments. The title, Yesterday We Said Tomorrow. And there'll be a series of monuments that will be placed throughout the city and contemporary art installations that will be both complicating our history and telling new stories through the work that they're doing. And then I will end with two quick examples of some projects that I think show the way in which technology could be helpful here. You know, the bronze sculpture, like the Kende Wiley sculpture, is a process that takes, you know, months and years and quite a lot of resources to create. But I think I'm inspired and encouraged by some of the tools that are being put into the hands of both students and the general public. So this particular app called the Pedestal Project allows people to add a filter into their Instagram that includes a series, in this case it's John Lewis, but there's a series of iconic civil rights figures that can actually then be placed, and so you use your camera to take a picture of the empty pedestal and replace it with one of the historic figures that they've outlined here. And then a similar app is Kinfolk, which is by Movers and Shakers, a New York City-based tech company. In this case here, one of the avatars in their app is Shirley Chisholm, and in this case here, replacing the Christopher Columbus Monument, virtually replacing it in New York City with Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution. Sorry, screen stopped here. And then I want to just give a very quick peek at some things that are coming up at Grounds for Sculpture that I think build off of my thinking and the team's thinking in these areas here. Our exhibition that will be opening a year from now, but that we're working on right now, is with artist Roberto Lugo. And artist Roberto Lugo is a ceramic artist, so not monuments in bronze and stone, but is decidedly working in the area of creating greater representation and building sense of community through the medium of ceramics, co-opting, subverting sort of the historic European and Asian ceramic techniques. And then on those surfaces, memorializing and elevating and centering the stories of Black and Brown history. So in this case here, we have Martin Luther King. This particular one here is AOC, and have on the bottom, you have Taino petroglyphs, and those of you that have traveled to Puerto Rico will recognize the coquí, the national frog of Puerto Rico. We've got bell hooks on the right side here, author bell hooks. And then again, he spans throughout, both from civil rights to literary and cultural figures. And here we've got Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls. And Roberto will be creating a large scale ceramic vessel in which the public will be able to place themselves and enter into this space of memorialization and storytelling. So with that, I will stop. And I apologize, Linda and I think we've used most of our time, but I think the hope here was that our talk generated the seeds and spark for the conversation throughout the day. I'm looking quickly to see, Linda, I don't know if you've seen if there are any questions that have come up.
Someone is moderating the chat for us. Are there any questions there?
This is Sam. No, they're not. A lot of compliments. I think that you both gave us a lot to think about and to start to visualize. It's really wonderful. I want to remind people that the next session of our workshop will begin at 11. So you can tune in on the same link. And that session will be led by Beverly Mills and Elaine Buck, who will both moderate and present on their own experiences, but there will be others, including Reverend Lundy, who will talk about the cemetery that Linda mentioned. So if one last chance for people to put anything in the chat. I see a lot of excellent presentations, thanks, and so on. So we'll see everyone then at 11. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda and Gary.
Our pleasure.
Yes.